Welcome agents. So today was the day for PvP and Dark Zone news. There's quite a bit here, and as usual, I'm going to break down the whole state of the game in this video. If you enjoyed this one, please hit the like button below, subscribe for dedicated Division 2 content, and let's do this. Alright, so Hamish Bode didn't host this one, he was away. Instead we had Chris Gansler hosting, with Keith Evans, game designer at Redstorm, along with Terry Spire, the creative director at Redstorm, talking about PvP. But first, we got the priority alerts. So, there will be no maintenance tomorrow, second week in a row, but we haven't got any maintenance for that. The PTS started on Monday. I'm sure most of you are either playing it or probably aware of it, certainly if you watch this channel. And the second wave of the PTS will obviously start next Monday, but there isn't really any information on that yet. We're going to be getting balance changes, among other things, but they've said to, watch out for their social media, Twitter and all that sort of stuff. But if you don't want to do that, then just make sure you got your notifications turned on, because I will almost certainly be making a video about that. They then want to talk about the PTS feedback, specifically the Eagle Bearer nerf. Now, I knew this was going to come up because ultimately the Eagle Bearer nerf has overshadowed the entire PTS, and I kind of expected that when I read through the patch notes. So yeah, what they've said is they've heard the feedback, they hear it and all that sort of stuff, but they just want to advise essentially that the PTS is a test server, which means that there's iteration on there, and there's going to be quite a lot of iteration, and it's easy to make changes on the test server as opposed to the actual game, which is why they've put it on the test server to see what people think and test out the waters. It's not in full and final, and they want you to keep that in mind. However, they did go on to talk about Wave 2 and the balance changes. Okay, and what they've said is that with Wave 2 there's going to be a lot of balance changes, I imagine, to the weapons. They talked about increasing weapon damage, and I assume that's going to be on weapons that aren't quite as good. There's going to be gear set balance, and until this stuff comes out, it's really hard to say whether the Eagle Bearer nerf is a good one or a bad one, because essentially we've only got half of the picture at this point in time. Again, with that said, the Eagle Bearer, and they've said, is just too strong. Even with the feedback from what everyone's saying in a petition that I saw for this, which I just think is crazy for a game, a petition for a game. But anyway, with that, even with all of that, they still think the Eagle Bearer is too strong. They've said that this weapon dominates both PvE and PvP. If you have it, you don't use any other weapon, and it doesn't matter what build you run, essentially it's still too strong. It's too much for the game, and regardless of whether people wanted it nerfed or buffed or whatever, that they believe it's too strong, and it is going to catch a nerf, essentially. What I got from this is, regardless of what people say, it's going to be nerfed. Whether it's the 15% it currently is at, or maybe something a little less impacting, like 5%, we don't know, but I imagine it's certainly going to be nerfed, and other weapons are going to be buffed up. What they are going to do, however, is they are going to look at talents for the exotics, and they are looking at buffing the Eagle Bearer talents and other exotic talents as well. And they specifically said stuff like holster talents, and I think the reason they said this is because the counter to the Eagle Bearer is the P416 and Nemesis combination, and part of that being so strong, part of that combination is due to the holster talent on the Nemesis, because you can throw on a 3.4 sight, which gives you the extra damage to elites, plus you get the buff from Nemesis, which makes the P416 actually really, really strong in that instance. So I think what they were doing when they talked about holster talents is they were referring to that. I assume they're also referring to the Chatterbox holster talent as well. So they are going to be looking to buff the Eagle Bearer talents and other exotic talents as well. They said that Frederick Thylander will be on next week to discuss this in more detail, and he's been very vocal on Twitter about this sort of stuff. So that's the priority alerts. Let's move on to the dev interview with Keith Evans and Terry Spire talking about PvP. Okay, so the interview started off by just confirming that, Redstorm are a large part of the PvP. They have some PvP experts at Massive, but ultimately it's mainly dealt with by Redstorm. And they went on to talk about plans for TU6 and the Dark Zone. So devs confirmed, the devs being Keith Evans and Terry Spire, that the two biggest focuses for them in the DZ was a DZ incentive and full servers. Okay, so they confirmed that they developed the Dark Zone around 12 players, and in testing with a full server, it was popping off, essentially. And at this point, no one's really experienced that because the servers just simply weren't there, because the matchmaking essentially wasn't working as intended. Okay, so what they want is for people to walk into the DZ and there to be a full server, and that's not quite happened at this point due to stuff that hasn't been implemented in the game. What they've said is that in the future, if you walk into the DZ and there's no players, what they will do is they will transfer you to a server which is full of players, essentially, an active server where you can participate in a 12-player server. And if that all works and you go into a 12-player server, then there's no real need to actually have 16 or increased players. At this point in time, and Terry Spire went through a metaphor. Essentially, you've got 10 glasses of whiskey, and they're filled up a little bit. It doesn't make sense to actually just, increase the size of the whiskey glass, because you've still only got a little bit of whiskey in there. Essentially, what you're going to want to do is put the only way to actually fill that whiskey up is to put more in it, essentially. And it's not until then that you can decide whether you want a bigger whiskey glass. I hope that kind of makes sense. At this point in time, increasing the size of the Dark Zone will not make any difference, because all it will do is you've got 16 players in a Dark Zone, but you're still going to be no one in the Dark Zone just because it hasn't worked properly. So until they can fill these DZ servers with 12 players and it works properly, they can't decide on whether they need to increase the server size. And that kind of makes sense to me. That kind of does make sense to me. At least the times that I've gone into Dark Zone, which, I'll be honest, guys, I'm no DZ expert. I barely go in there. But when I have, they haven't been very full. It's very few and far between. So if they've made this change that should ensure that, then maybe in the future we can consider, bigger DZ size. So there we go. So that was one of the most important topics for them, making sure that these servers, were completely full. Okay, and then they went on to talk about incentives. So they've talked about changes to supply drops. They're going to have supply drops drop inside inactive landmarks, and they're going to make them, they said, more special. But essentially what they're going to do is they're going to have factions fighting over the supply drops. And with each of these, faction wars, essentially, there's going to be bosses and all that sort of stuff. So there's going to be a lot more opportunity for loot. Okay, now, they said that that's obviously going to be in the normalized Dark Zone. In the occupied Dark Zone, when you open up the mega map, you're going to be able to see extractions. They're going to be adding events. Okay, so in the ODZ, they're going to be adding a supply drop one at a time, and they're only going to be protected by Black Tusk bosses. Okay, so I hope you're still catching up with me here. Moving on, they've confirmed that they're going to be adding something called ambushes as well. This is a low percentage chance that the Black Tusk choppers will come in after seeing your flares. Black Tusk will come down and you've got to fight them. You've got to decide whether you want to wait around for your helicopter because it will come in before yours and extract, or you want to run away, essentially. Now, these Black Tusk choppers are already very rare in the game. I've actually seen maybe 3 or 4 in my time of playing. Some people have never seen them. They're actually really cool. And I would have liked to have seen a bit more stuff with this, because at the moment they don't really add a lot of value to the game. So maybe this will help with that. You guys will have to let me know. If any of you DZ experts will have to let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. Moving on. Now, what they've done is they've got a new or updated resource. They've overhauled the Thieves Den Vendor. The Thieves Den Vendor will have a storefront with rotating stock, which will have high tier items. At the moment, they've not confirmed what those items are. So on the PTS, that vendor will be stocked, but it won't be the sort of stock you'd expect from the live game. But they've said that's still a work in progress. They will trade, or the DZ... The Thieves Den Vendor will trade in DZ resources, and all 3 DZ resources have been combined to make it more meaningful. So you don't have to go to this DZ to get that resource or that DZ to get that one. It's just going to all be combined into one. And the vendors outside the gates of the Dark Zone will trade in that resource as well. There's going to be easier ways to find resources when you go rogue. The example being that if you hack a Shade terminal, it lets you see loot around you, just like in the LZ when you're donating materials, essentially. Then they went on to talk about the Diamondback glitch. It was kind of just interrupted, and they said about the Diamondback glitch in PvP. I did a video on this, so I'm going to be sending that to those guys because they want more information on that as well. Then they want to talk about the point of normalization. So they wanted to obviously make it known that the reason they had normalization is to get everyone on the same sort of playing field, which makes sense. That's what normalization is. I get it. Now, what they have done over the months leading up to this point is they've adjusted normalization throughout, but the biggest change that they're going to make now is they're just going to kind of get rid of the concept of normalization at endgame. So, from now on in TU6, at endgame, any recal bonuses will remain on your gear. So it won't be normalized down or anything like that. It will remain as is. And what that will do is it means that if you're at 500 gear score and you've got those recal stuff, then you will have advantage over players who haven't done that. Essentially, they are going to be keeping the boost for players who are under gear score 500 to boost their gear up to 500. But obviously, if you're investing time in recal, you're not going to be penalised for that. There are some huge UI changes coming as well, where you can be able to see, your PvP weapon damage specifically, PvP cooldowns, and there's going to be a lot more UI changes so that you know exactly what your weapons and all your stuff is doing in PvP without you having to toggle it and it all kind of going wrong, essentially. They've also confirmed that talents will change in PvP as well, so that if you open up your loadout in PvP, the talents will change to their PvP specific talent as well, and you'll get to see that as well. And what they've said as well is that with normalization in TU6, they want to focus more on offensive being more powerful, because they realise that at the moment there's a lot of tank builds, and that's because offensive builds are being kind of just mitigated too much. So what they've done is they've kind of relaxed that a little bit. They've made offensive, more focus on offensive, so that you feel more powerful against tank builds. It also means that it kind of brings it up towards tank builds, so that both of them are viable. And obviously with the changes being said here, Recal is going to be much more important for PvP now, as it will be more impactful in PvP, because you're going to be able to keep those Recal bonuses. Then Chris went on to ask the question of the devs of basically what the devs expect in respect of the meta for TU6. And they went on to talk about TU5 with skills being very strong and tanky builds, and that's when they started talking about the buff to the offensive orientated builds to make it more viable against tank. So that's good news. I think that's really good news that they've seen that the tank build is kind of the meta, certainly in normalized game modes here, and they've decided to actually buff, in many ways, offensive orientated builds to try and get those two closer together so that both of those builds are much more viable in PvP. They didn't, however, mention how skill builds are not very strong in normalized game mode. Certainly like damage skill builds from my understanding, and they didn't talk about that, and that's something I would have liked to them talk about, but we didn't get anything about that. Moving on. And we're going to get on to a little bit of good stuff here, guys. This is the most important stuff for me, at least. They talked about conflict and the incentivizing in conflict. And they talked about the end of game rewards are changing. There are 3 rewards essentially in conflict. You get, you won a match, you've ranked up, and new high score. And from what their data suggests, it's that the high score kind of reward essentially isn't there anymore. Everyone got their high score ages ago, and no one's getting it anymore. So what they've done is they've removed that, and you're going to get a match complete reward instead. So essentially, as long as you stay in every match, you're going to get rewarded every single time. That's what I got from that. Also, conflicts didn't have any projects, so there is going to be a weekly project with rewards tied to it for conflict, and the Dark Zone daily project will rotate between Dark Zone and conflict as well. And then the biggest news, I think, is that there's a new PvP mode coming. Now, this is going to be a round-based team elimination game mode, best of 7, 1 life. So it's going to be pretty hardcore. It's going to be a lot more, there is no hardcore conflict mode. So this is filling that gap, essentially. So it's obviously focused on team play. It's more, team PvP and making sure players don't die, essentially. There's going to be new boosts within this round-based team elimination. They confirmed a team revive boost, a proximity pulse boost, and there's probably going to be a lot more in there. And then they inserted this video, which I'm going to show for you guys now, which is a work in progress on this new mode. So take a look.
There it comes. So yeah, as Keith and Terry said, this is a complete new mode, team elimination. It's coming to the second wave of the PTS. And, Ella says you can also talk over that. So then I'll just give it back to you guys, and you can maybe talk a little bit about the strategy involved in all this.
It's, I'll say that it's not mind-breaking, strategy. It really is work together with your team and understand that if you try to play hero and you die, you're going to put your team at an extreme disadvantage. So it really is understanding where you are, understanding where your teammates are, and we've all played this kind of PvP mode before.
Yeah, I love PvP modes like this.
It was just missing from the Division 2 repertoire. So, being able to, coordinate, and that means coordination on position, coordination on skill use and selection. That means.
Last but not least, the devs confirmed that you will be able to switch loadouts between map voting as well. So really, that's it, guys. Hopefully you did enjoy this one. I might do a follow-up video talking about what I think about this news, just as a quick synopsis or a quick summary of my own thoughts. I think there's some good changes here, but I don't think it's enough. That's just what I'm thinking initially. I don't think there's any changes to the core PvP experience. There was also no news about lag and all that sort of stuff, which is what I've complained about before, and that's a real shame. But I will probably do a follow-up video to that. Anyway, that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. If you did, again, drop a like. It really does help me out. If you stuck around to the end, really do appreciate it. And until the next one, guys, epic out.